Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri inviting our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on U.S. and China in the world. Today's program is part of a special series in which Polaris Live invited 7 experts from the U.S. and China and the Middle East to offer their perspectives on the recently concluded 20th Communist Party in Beijing. That should be the 20th Communist Party Conference in Beijing. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. My guest today is Mr. Shehzad Qazi. Shehzad Qazi is the managing director of China Beige Book, where he oversees product innovation and corporate strategy. He has published widely on U.S. China Relations, Chinese foreign policy, tradition, and all of the things that go into making the markets in China and America very strong, very liquid, and rising. So, without further ado, Mr. Shehzad Qazi. Welcome, Mr. Qazi. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you for having me on.
Yes, you're coming to us from, some would say, the center of the economic world, New York, though there are other powerful voices who would strongly disagree. Which side do you fall on?
I think New York is still, by and large, the financial center of the world.
Listen, Shehzad, if I may call you that, this recently ended conference of the Chinese Communist Party, it's held every 5 years, really big affair. The Chinese government claimed that the economy was rebounding, but you disagree and maintain that China's economy continued to struggle, slowing significantly from year-ago level. That's a bold position to take, so please explain.
Sure. So, as you know, we covered the Chinese economy in a lot of granular detail and surveyed thousands of companies out there. And I can tell you that the results in the third quarter showed no improvement really over the second quarter. And why does that matter? The second quarter was incredibly weak. It was a period where you got a massive months-long lockdown in Shanghai. You had Beijing in a de facto lockdown. And you had other parts of the country that were going in and out of the zero COVID lockdowns that have defined China's strategy to combat the COVID virus. And so economic performance was incredibly poor in the second quarter. And when we got to the third quarter, you would have assumed that things would start to improve, but that really wasn't the case. You have the manufacturing sector, which was struggling to bounce back. You have the property market, which is in a deep hole and is seeing outright contractions, and the housing market is just negative growth at this point. You've got minor improvement in the services and the retail side that is a consumption side of the economy, but that quite frankly isn't saying much when you're coming off such a low base where households are just locked in and locked up and unable to spend. And if you compare everything to year-ago levels, as you just said, things looked pretty bleak. So the Chinese GDP data, which by the way was more than a week late and created a lot of concern, I think, among the markets, in my opinion, is a lot more upbeat. And quite frankly, I think it clashes with a lot of their own official numbers, which continue to soften into September.
Shehzad, let me just interrupt briefly. As I understand the Chinese GDP, I was to explain, one of the guys explained to me that they do it differently than we do or the West does, in that they set a GDP number and then strive to hit it, as opposed to the United States and Europe and so on, where we actually report what's happening in the economy. Is that correct? And I didn't mean to interfere, but I wanted you to tell me about that.
No, you hit the nail on the head. In China, the GDP, by the way, is a political number first and an economic number second. You have targets, as you just said. You have to do whatever it takes to hit the target, which means if you want to dig a ditch and fill it back up again and dig it again, you do that because that contributes towards national economic activity.
Wow.
And so the GDP number is most certainly not only indicative of actual growth or actual activity when you compare it to what happens out west, but more importantly, I think for the sake of where the Chinese economy is headed and where it's been, It's not an indicator of productive growth.
Okay. So, but I want to dig in just a little bit on China's performance. A lot of it, I would suppose, has to do with the zero COVID policy, as they say, right? And what I want to ask you is a little bit philosophical and a little bit economic. In other words, they shut down large cities, including cities like Shanghai, which are one of the engines that power China's economy. And the criticism from our side, the U.S. side, is, hey, listen, you have to stop doing that because this is going to hurt your economy. This is an anchor on your economy. But as I understand it, President Xi Jinping measures success in public health, right? In other words, containment of the virus, as you've pointed out in some of your writings also, is his primary concern. As a lot of people point out, China's public could not stand 1 million Chinese being killed by the pandemic. Right. So is this philosophical difference between us really open to criticism? I mean, can we not say, okay, well, if that's the way they do it, then they should do it? One. And two, isn't Mr. Xi saying, okay, so my GDP drops by 1%? Well, I would much rather not have 1 million Chinese killed. Can you just talk about that?
Yeah, let me make perhaps a few different observations on that. The first one, of course, is that if today the Chinese authorities, the Chinese government, Secretary Xi himself, wanted access to mRNA vaccines, they could purchase them and they could have access to them. A lot of those conversations and deals have fallen apart, most recently because there's a demand on the Chinese side that Moderna, for example, hand over its vaccine technology and IP essentially over to the Chinese authorities. And so ultimately they're able to do that locally themselves. Moderna, of course, said no, and so the deal fell apart. Prior to that, however, we saw quite a bit of resistance from the Chinese government in accessing foreign-made vaccines. And part of this ties into the Chinese economic nationalism, if you will, that has been on display, where the idea was we will have our own vaccines. Our vaccines are going to be just as good, if not superior to the Western vaccines, and we'll defeat the virus on our own. Now, the bottom line is that Chinese local-made vaccines are not as the efficacy rates are significantly lower. They're not that effective, and they haven't really worked. The second problem, of course, is they do not only not have mRNA vaccines, they've also not been able to vaccinate enough of the population, especially the adult population. And they haven't pushed through an aggressive national campaign to do that either. So that is apart from the philosophical differences, there is some resistance, which ties into, I think, the ultimate need for China to prove its supremacy on the global stage. But now putting that aside, those are facts that we're well aware of. I think a big problem in the larger analysis from Western banks and markets in general, I think market commentators in general, has been that they continuously think that China is going to let go of its zero COVID policy, which it quite frankly doesn't really have an option but to rely on that given everything I just described, because they feel that the primary goal for China is always growth. For Xi is economic recovery, and therefore he will let go of zero COVID. And as you just said, what I think a lot of folks out in the West have completely failed to realize is just because they think growth and an economic rebound is a primary concern, that doesn't mean that that's what Xi's actually concerned about. He is absolutely, in the absence of access to the therapeutics and vaccines and enough inoculations around the country, has no option but to keep the economy in a perpetual state of lockdown, because the alternative would not only be deeply socially, would cause deep social instability, millions of deaths, etc. It would overwhelm the hospital system. It would show how weak China's is in many ways internally. And of course, it would actually be probably much more devastating for the economy if they were to go that route. So zero COVID then is really the only option unless those underlying realities change.
Yes, it's well, I was going to bring up something a little later, but I'm going to take advantage of what you just said. to bring it up now. And that is, you were at the Foreign Policy Association conference where my report was released, suggesting that it's time that we put politicians kind of in a corner and let the business people on both sides go ahead. And let's see if that helps to thaw the relationship. And the thought just occurred to me is that perhaps Mr. Biden should, extend a hand and say, hey, President Xi, we have this vaccine that works. What if we go halves on this? You don't have to take Moderna's patent, but what if we pay half of this? Do you think a gesture like that might help to do what I'm suggesting in the book, which is increase the business ties between the two? What's your thought?
I think first of all, my position would be that I think it would be a bit concerning if you had any sitting U.S. officials trying to advocate on behalf of any one U.S. company, right? So we want to always be very careful of politicians, trying to essentially find business deals directly for any one company. Perhaps if you're doing it for a level playing field, where you provide the same level of access to the various pharmaceutical companies that are involved in the different parts of it. And of course, we know it's the big ones that really matter. And ultimately, they are the ones who would have that kind of access. Perhaps something could be done, but it doesn't seem to me, and this is where I think, the realization on the American side has really kicked into high gear. I think it was there from the beginning, but now everybody's well aware of it, that when it comes to doing business in China, it's always going to be politics first and business second. You cannot sidestep the politics, and you have to be very careful about that. And I think any attempts to assume that the American corporations could go willy-nilly and have full access to the Chinese market and make a lot of money without any downside risk, I think a lot of them have paid heavily for that misconception.
But Shehzad, let me push back on that just a little bit. Isn't it also true that China has been increasingly opening sectors to the economy? Right. For example, managing money, the so-called private bank, and so on. They've just loosened some of the constraints on that. And therefore, more American companies are lining up to do business. American companies can now, they don't have to have a minority stake. They can take a majority stake, almost 100%. So they are opening up. But it is indeed true that every business there has a Chinese government official or officials on it. But if that's the way they want to do business, as long as they're opening up and profits can be repatriated, shouldn't we live with that?
I think there has been a market, there has been market opening in China, but it hasn't come over the last 30 years. First of all, it hasn't come without companies, as we all know, the complaints about forced technology transfers that are done on the basis of previously having to have forced JVs on the ground, having to have those Chinese partners on the ground. It has still comes alongside heavy amounts of state subsidies towards the Chinese companies and Chinese competitors that these companies have to contend with. So you have all those issues that are ongoing. Now, of course, to your point, though, Wall Street, I would say, over the last 4 to 5 years now, has certainly been the big winner. And you've seen that Wall Street banks have put, in a lot of emphasis on capturing the Chinese market and in getting those, being able to do the IPO deals, being able to do a different, manage different sums of money and so forth. But it's also not necessarily been an easy road. And at times you've seen that saying the wrong thing can get you in a lot of trouble. I'll bring you the case in point being JP Morgan, which previously, last year or so, had internal analysts saying that, look, there are certain Chinese stocks that we currently see as uninvestable given the regulatory crackdown that is going on. And the bank tried to actually, as we now know, suppress that call from being written in any of the reports. And somehow they missed it and actually made it through finally in one of the places. The bank, in response, lost a pretty sweet IPO deal that it was taken off of.
Really?
And just a few weeks later, 6 weeks later, I think, something like that, ended up reversing its call And all the same stocks that it previously had said were uninvestable, now all of a sudden were the right place to put your money at.
Investable.
So that is ultimately the realities at times of doing business in China, I would say. Not always.
Listen, your company is reputed as having tentacles into hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese companies that you monitor on an ongoing basis. Can you take a minute just to tell me if that is true? And how do you get access when everyone says that China is so opaque? So just briefly, can you tell us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we survey thousands of Chinese companies in any given month. We created a data collection platform that is now almost 11 years old. And the idea is that, we wanted to not just do these minor or mini surveys that come out where you go to Beijing or Shanghai and you survey a few private companies and you say, look, this is how the economy is doing. We said we want to survey and collect data from every part of the economy. So we cover all the sectors. We cover state firms and private firms. We cover large firms and SMEs, and in every part of China geographically. Now we got in. This whole process began, about 12 or 13 years ago at this point, and we were able to get into China at a time where the market was much more amenable and much more open to establishing these types of data collection networks and be able to conduct the type of private or independent research that has increasingly become difficult to do. Several government-based high-frequency indicators, such as the Guangdong PMI, have just been discontinued. We know for a fact the Chinese government has discontinued, I think at this point, hundreds, if not thousands of its own various indicators that it used to put out through the NBS, the National Bureau of Statistics. We know lots of other private entities that have tried to do surveys in China in recent years have faced a very difficult market. So part of it was just the first mover advantage, if you will.
But why haven't they stopped you, Shehzad?
Yeah, I think, we get that question all the time. I think one of the key things, if you follow the track record for China Beige Book, is that we don't have any type of a priori bias, right? We're not China bears. We're not China bulls. We're not in the business, quite frankly, of coming out with bearish and bullish calls or giving specific stock and trading advice. And I think that helps a long way because our job is to look at the numbers and give a neutral call or objective call, rather, if you will, on are things getting better, are things getting worse, where is the improvement, where is the weakness, and then kind of make some macroeconomic outlook comments on that basis. But we base everything on what our numbers say. And that's very interesting for us to do because it oftentimes will mean that the market consensus will be going one way and we'll be going another way, not always in the negative. So not always when the market is exuberant and we come out and say it's time to be cautious, but many instances the market is going to be downright negative on China. And our numbers have said, actually, there are pockets of strength that are worth looking at and paying attention to. Okay. And I think that has helped us a long way.
Thank you. So reverting back to the questions I have remaining, we have a few minutes to go. How seriously does your company factor in the Taiwan risk scenario into what you do? Or does that not play any part? You're just strictly sticking with the numbers?
Taiwan and U.S. China tensions over Taiwan and the risk of military action and escalating political tensions over Taiwan are top of mind for our clients. And over the last couple of weeks, maybe month or so now, I think every conversation that I've had with some of either the biggest Fortune 500 corporations or the big global hedge funds that are based out of here in Connecticut, it's been the topic of conversation very soon. Our view is that as time goes by, as in the coming months, years, the risk of escalation is only rising. The risk of conflict is only rising. The risk of accidental conflict, by the way, which doesn't get talked about enough, is also rising. 5 years out, we may be looking at an even chance of U.S.-China military action over Taiwan. So that's very high. That's a very scary proposition.
Indeed.
So Taiwan is something that we're incredibly focused on. I think what you're seeing right now is the weapons of war being utilized, which are softer, right? You're looking at export controls. You're looking at companies being put on entity lists, heightening the barriers in terms of being able to transfer technology to China. And that is all ultimately linked to Taiwan's importance as one of the most important producers of semiconductors and chips and so forth in the world. In a few years, as in half a decade or so, does that turn into something much more scarier where there are ships and guns involved? Yeah,
it is a very scary thought, and I just wanted to see how you account for that. In the few minutes we have left, and we can take a couple more minutes here. Give me your personal company takeaways from the conference. Are there a couple of things that came out of it that the general media may or may not have missed that you paid attention to?
Yeah, I think a few things for sure. The first one is that whereas it was pretty much understood that the standing committee and so forth would be stacked by folks who are very loyal to or are allies of Secretary Xi, I think it ultimately took everybody by a little bit of surprise that it was entirely packed with folks who are loyal to Secretary Xi. The areas, though, where folks, I think, were surprised, and which is why you saw that massive sell-off on Monday, where literally hundreds of billions of dollars ultimately of Chinese equities erased across the world, if you look at them, was the fact that folks, I think, naively expected there to be major policy changes being announced at the Party Congress. We've already talked about the zero COVID policy, but other parts of it are expecting a new pledge that the regulatory crackdown on China would ease, that there would be great support for the private sector, that there would perhaps be a larger stimulus, policy stimulus, monetary stimulus that would take place. Now, these are expectations that we personally have been warning our clients to be very wary of, that this is not going to happen. And when it didn't happen, of course, those who were betting on it paid a dear price for it. But that was one of, I would say, our most counter-consensus views right into the Party Congress. And unfortunately, at this point, we were proven to be correct.
So we are running to the end here, but I did want to spend some time on the real estate problems that China is facing, right? Together with the zero COVID policy, that seems to come up all the time, Shehzad. And as I understand it, they've really not yet gotten full control of that issue. And what I want to know is that because it's so deep that it's very difficult? Is it because the lending entities are so dispersed? It's not just one entity that's lending it. And is the People's Bank of China really trying to grapple with how to do this? Have they found it? It's just a question of time. Just a general bit of knowledge, if you can leave it with us.
Sure. I think what you're seeing happening in the property market, first of all, was very intentional. There was the intention to cause pain because Beijing and the People's Bank of China and others for a long time had been warning these developers that their practices of excessive reliance on credit while in being unable to deliver on their existing projects was going to one day go bust. And that bubble ultimately went bust because the developers did not take heed and did not listen. So the pain partly is intentional as it relates to causing it to the developers and the very wealthy individuals who tend to run these companies. Now, it is also linked, I think, to a very serious campaign this time around to deleverage the economy overall, to bring down that mountain of debt on which the Chinese economy has run. So you're not going to get the type of bailouts that people expected because that would run counter to the priorities. What you are going to see and what you are seeing is the state sector having to intervene much more heavily to take over the projects that cannot be completed by these companies that are going bust. And ultimately a bailout, if I can call it that, it's a very aggressive word to use, of the Chinese consumer, of households who have sunk their savings in and are waiting on a house that they may never get. Making them whole, and as many as possible, I think, is the objective. The bottom line, I think, will be a lot of pain in the housing market for years to come, a lot of restructuring that needs to take place. Not everybody is going to be made whole. and property will never look the same in China again. Those days of property contributing towards 25 to 26% growth, they're long gone.
What kind of exposure do American investors have to the real estate market in China?
There are certain foreign investors, Americans, Europeans, etc., who most certainly own a lot of that debt and are now waiting on a payment, on getting paid back. And there are going to be serious losses. They're going to lose money.
The other related question is that this crackdown on both sides, America and China side, do you see that with international banks that are not American owned, or let's say Dutch banks or German banks or French banks, treated any differently than American banks are?
I'm not familiar to what extent foreign banks from European countries are finding it easier or more difficult to make their way into the Chinese market. But I mean, at the end of the day, when you look at the global investment bank picture, and I'm sticking with obviously the iBank side because there's no commercial or retail banking to really discuss. I think the biggest players are ultimately your American banks, and of course you've got some English and others in there. But ultimately, if things don't change for them very much, I don't anticipate things getting any easier for the European banks. So things being severely different for the European banks at all.
Okay. And as we wind down the program, I'd like you to leave some thoughts for our viewers as to where they ought to focus their reading, over the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, I think, as far as the China question is concerned, I think it's, important to understand how the economy is now evolving under Secretary Xi and the new Chinese growth model, as we have called it, or the new China growth playbook. Give up and ignore, even I would say, anybody who's trying to argue that this is an economy that continues to rely on high debt, high investment, and high growth. That economic model has run out of road. It's over, and there is a new playbook that the Chinese government and really, I think, Xi onwards are trying to chart. So focus on how the economy is going to develop now, and this is a very exciting time. Pay a lot of attention to the U.S. China tech competition. It can get very complicated, especially around very complicated rules of export controls and such. But I think any readership or viewers who are out there, I think that would be a very important place to focus and try to understand it in as much nuance as possible. And nuance is going to be very necessary on that. So maybe I'll do with those two things.
Yeah, you've just opened a door which I want to go through, and that is the meltdown this week of the technology sector here in the United States. All those big companies are starting to take some hits. Is that related in any way to what's happening in China?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we know, we got the executive order now about a couple of weeks ago restricting, and again the last 10 days restricting the export of certain technologies to China, and it goes into details of technological details of the semis and so forth. A lot of the tech meltdown that you saw was based on this fear that all of a sudden there has been a complete denial to Chinese companies of access to U.S. technology in terms of specific chips and so forth that we're talking about.
Yes.
That's actually not true. What has happened is that several companies have been put on this thing called the entity list at the Commerce Department. Now, the entity list is not a blacklist and it's not a ban list. It's just a list that says in order to do business with these companies, you have to go through an extra round of screening and obtain a license from the Commerce Department in order to continue doing business. And that part, I think, was grossly overlooked. And what also wasn't understood is the fact that the Commerce Department has a rather strong record of leaning towards giving licenses rather than not giving licenses. The BIS secretary was speaking just before you and I went on live. And he said, I disagree that 95% of the applications that come to us we give them licenses. We only give it to 67%. Well, if the 67% includes some of the biggest companies such as Intel and others, That
Sure.
tells you that the Commerce Department is still much more amenable. And by the way, that has happened. Some of the biggest companies got licenses and extensions to continue doing business as soon as this went into effect. So again, that's why I say it's important to know, read between the lines and know the nuances and the loopholes and the carve-outs in these policies.
Well, Mr. Shehzad Qazi, I wish we had more time. You've given us all a PhD in China-America business relations, but I'm afraid we're going to have to call it a day here. I hope you will come back and visit us again, and thank you so very much for joining Polaris Live today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, I wish we could go on with this program today, but time is of the essence. So I want to thank our viewers from around the world. Please join us again in this series of 7 episodes that concludes next week, in which we look at the 20th Party Conference in Beijing and what it means for the U.S., what it means for China, what it means for the world. And I hope to see you again tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.